I have 3 degrees, theology and philosophy, and percussion performance. So I like to tell people if I weren't a priest, I'd be living in a box. My senior year of high school, I was doing the rounds of the various places that I wanted to audition for my undergrad. You had to pass an audition in order to get into the various music programs. And the first one on my route was at the Manhattan School of Music in New York City. So my dad and he took me and we flew out there, and it was my first time to New York. As we're flying in, if you've ever been to New York, you know it's a behemoth of a city. You can fit like 15 Chicagos in New York. So it was pretty intimidating for me the first time flying in, knowing that I was going to be auditioning for a jazz program, and here's the city of jazz. And we get there, and the day of my audition was Ash Wednesday. So I was not having my usual high school boy diet of like a pizza and 3 burgers for breakfast. You know, I was on an empty stomach doing the Ash Wednesday fasting. And of course, Dad and I went to Mass in the morning, so we had ashes on our forehead. And when we show up at the school, it's one of those things where everybody's kind of looking at you like, what, you got like something on your head, you know? And I sit down, you know, probably about half an hour before I'm supposed to do my audition. They've got the whole roster there of everybody who's going in for their auditions. I'm sitting there, I've got my stick bag, and I'm nervous as heck. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. My audition was 3 hours late, 3 hours behind schedule. So you can imagine, I'm hungry, I'm nervous, I'm terrified. Finally, I go in for my audition, and it's one of these big, huge rehearsal halls. And I have to awkwardly walk all across the hall till I get to the drum set. And at the other side of the room, there's this panel of faculty judges watching and waiting. And I sit down, and the way that often it works for auditions for a jazz program is that you don't just play alone, they have you sit down with a jazz combo, a small group of musicians. So there's musicians from their music program, students in the college there, very good, talented musicians that I have to sit down and try and not just play well myself, but interact well with them. So it's really nerve-wracking. We start playing, and I feel like it's going okay, but really early on, the guy who's the head percussion teacher there cuts us off, says, stop, 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 stop. And he walks over and he kneels down next to me, right in my face. He says, start it again. And I'm shaking, I'm terrified now. And we never get further than about 30 seconds into a song, and he stops. Or sometimes, as I'm playing, he's snapping next to me to keep me in time. Anybody here ever seen the movie Whiplash? You know, it's kind of like that, right? It's one of those moments where there's this terrifying music professor right next to you, judging everything that you do. And he's saying, you're too fast here, you're too slow there, you're too loud here, you're too quiet here. He's tearing me apart in this audition. And I just feel terrible, because this is my first audition. I'm like, if that's how this one goes, what's going to happen with all the others? I thought I bombed it. I thought it was a disaster. Later, I find out that I got in, and I get an email from the percussion teacher. We'd love to have you here. Let me know anytime you want to talk about our music program here. We'd like to get you here. I responded to him. I was like, I cannot believe it. I thought it was a disaster. I thought there was no way I was ever going to get in. I mean, you were tearing me apart in that audition. Everything I did, you had something to critique. And he said, well, that's the thing. I wanted to see how you were going to react. How you were going to react in that moment to the various things I wanted you to change. Were you going to crumble under that instruction, or would you adapt, even in the moment, even something that's so nerve-wracking as an audition like that? He said, the reason I was acting that way and the reason I was being so hard on you is I wanted you to get in, and I wanted you to be ready when you got here. You know, I have a priest buddy who says that, he likes to say that Jesus often gave the worst pep talks ever. If you want to be, he's not exactly a salesman, right? If you want to be a Christian, awesome, great news. You're going to have to pick up your cross daily and follow me. You've got to follow all of the rules that God has given us perfectly. You're going to have to be humble, be chaste, be generous, be kind, be merciful, forgive everyone, no matter how many times they hurt you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. You might be poor, but don't worry. Eventually, one day, the stars are going to fall from the sky, and I'm going to come and the whole world is going to end. Sign me up. Jesus does not hold back. You know, the psychologist Carl Jung once said, speculating about kind of psychoanalyzing the Christian canon of the New Testament, said that the book of Revelation, written by the Apostle John, is kind of a psychological phenomenon in the sense that Christians had in the Gospels sweet, gentle, kind, and compassionate Jesus. But the Apostle John had this experience which comes from the fact that they needed, as a religion, needed something to balance that out. Christ as judge. They needed to see Christ as judge at the end of time. He saw that as kind of a psychological phenomenon. And while that does make sense psychologically speaking, as a biblical scholar, it's bad work. Because the truth is we see right in the narrative of the Gospels, Jesus speaking harsh and at times scary words about the end of times. It's not something that comes later in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is right in harmony with the full story of Jesus. And we get that in the gospel reading today. The artist Michelangelo, we all know the Sistine Chapel, we all know the ceiling, right? We all know the famous image of the creation of Noah with the finger of God, Adam, with God and Adam and their fingers touching. But what often gets overlooked or not as well known is the painting on the wall behind the altar, which is the scene of the Last Judgment. I used to give tours at the Sistine Chapel, and very often when people would come in, they'd be shocked and surprised by that painting of the Last Judgment, of the return of Christ. First of all, you have the saints surrounding Christ, many martyrs who are carrying the instruments of their own martyrdom. Those things that were the ways in which they died for the faith. But then also you have below, toward the bottom, right around the altar, the scene of many souls rising from the dead, but then many souls being cast into hell. And it's kind of a scary scene. And one of the things that I have to explain to people is, you see, Michelangelo really didn't intend this to be seen by all of the lay faithful. It had a very specific purpose. The Sistine Chapel is where they hold papal conclaves, where they hold elections of new popes. And Michelangelo is painting in the mid-16th century, a time when many people had a fear about the state and the direction of the church because of corruption within the hierarchy. And so Michelangelo, without saying a word, has the cardinals shaking in their boots when they come into the Sistine Chapel, because as they gather there and they're walking toward the altar to place their ballots in the bin for who to elect as the next pope, they see the severity, the almost scariness of this scene of the Last Judgment. Michelangelo wanted to prick their consciences so that they would be making this election, they would be choosing the successor to Peter for the right reasons, not for selfish gains. The church does a similar thing for us in the calendar year, in this liturgical year. As we approach the end of our liturgical year, right before we step into Advent, which is just around the corner, so get your shopping list ready for Christmas, the church presents us with readings about the end of time, the last things. And what we get in our gospel today from Christ, painting a picture for us of what that's going to look like. At first, for us, it seems scary. St. Augustine, praying over this passage from the Gospel of Mark and commenting on it, said, "Why is it that we would be afraid? If we love Jesus Christ the way that we say we do, if we trust him the way that we say that we do, wouldn't this reading be for us something that would be a cause for joy, that we would look forward to the coming of Christ?" and yet we're still scared. St. Augustine says that the reason is that we love our sins just a little bit more than we love Jesus. You see, when Jesus tells us the truths about what's to come, and about the fact that we never know when the end of time truly will be. He even says, I don't even know, only the Father knows. It's quite an interesting point there. When he gives us this warning and he tells us the circumstances surrounding the coming of his heavenly kingdom, of the return of Christ, he's not saying it to scare us. He's not saying it to upset us. He's saying it to us because he wants us to get in and he wants us to be ready when we get there.